Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Canstrom, and it is my great pleasure as Faculty Director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy at Boston College to welcome you to this event, which is co-sponsored by the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston at Harvard's Kennedy School. What we're going to have today is a debate about one of the most challenging and complex political legal issues of our time, or indeed of any time, and that is whether non-citizens should have the right to vote. I'm a professor of immigration law, administrative law, and human rights law, and I can tell you that I've studied this question for many years. Its roots go back at least to Aristotle, who, as some of you may know, was himself not a citizen of Athens. It's been a long-standing question in the United States with many implications that include not only this country's complicated relationship to immigration and immigrants, but also to things like the Dred Scott case and the history of the 14th Amendment, even the history of the Administrative Procedure Act and the evolution of due process and many constitutional rights. In fact, in one of the foundational administrative law cases, that of Wang Yang Sun versus McGrath, Justice Robert Jackson, who was former Attorney General and former lead prosecutor at Nuremberg, referred to non-citizens who were facing deportation proceedings that violated parts of the newly enacted APA as, quote, a voteless class of litigants, end quote, which is a quite profound formulation, I would suggest, the more you think about it, and I think we are going to think about it today. And yet, as we will learn, non-citizen voting in local and state elections is not a new phenomenon. It has deep roots in many parts of this country and is still currently the law in a few places, which we'll undoubtedly also hear about. So welcome. We're going to proceed, and after the presentations, I would ask people who are viewing this to use the Q&A function for their cues. Actually, you provide the cues and we'll provide the A's. And also to note that this event is being recorded. Your particular Q&A will be part of a transcript that is available to the public, so you should know that, and everything else is being recorded. We are very fortunate to have an outstanding moderator and excellent panelists to discuss these matters, so I want to turn things over to the moderator with a brief introduction. Our moderator is Guy-Uriel Charles, who is the Charles Ogletree Jr. Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and was the founding director of the Duke Law Center on Law, Race, and Politics. He teaches and writes about election law, race and law, constitutional law, and civil procedure. He's published articles in many top law reviews and is the co-author of Election Law in the American Political System and Racial Justice and Law Cases and Materials. He's co-editor of The New Black, What Has Changed and What Has Not with Race in America, and Race Reform and Regulation of the Electoral Process, Recurring Puzzles in American Democracy. He's currently working on a new book with a co-author on voting rights and the Voting Rights Act. Professor Charles received his JD from the University of Michigan Law School and clerked for the Honorable Damon J. Keith of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. While at Michigan, he was the founder and first editor-in-chief of the Michigan Journal of Race and Law, and he was a graduate student in political science there as well. I have had the pleasure of hearing Professor Charles speak a number of times, and I greatly admire his work. So it's really my pleasure and honor to turn things over to him now.
Thank you so much, Dan. Really kind of you. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and to moderate this wonderful debate at this amazing law school for this truly outstanding center, the Rappaport Center. We have two, as Dan said, amazing panelists who will provide us with their insights on this question. The first person who will speak, I'll introduce both of them, and then they'll each have about 7 minutes to make an opening statement. Elizabeth Sweet is the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition. The coalition's mission is to advance the rights and integration of immigrants and refugees in Massachusetts and beyond. It works to build a commonwealth where immigrants and refugees feel welcome, empowered to fully participate in economic, social, and civic life. Ms. Sweet brings to the coalition an 18-year record of advocacy for immigrants and refugees. For the past 6 years, she has served in the senior leadership roles at the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, most recently as its Chief Operating Officer. She's a graduate of Northeastern University School of Law. She set out to defend immigrants and asylum seekers and immigration detention during their deportation hearings. She later became the first full-time director of the American Bar Association Immigration Justice Project in San Diego, and then the associate director of the American Bar Commission on Immigration in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Elizabeth Sweet. It's great to have you here. Our second speaker will be Raymond Mariano, who served 4 terms as mayor of Worcester, Massachusetts, 10 terms on the city council, and 2 terms of the Worcester School Committee. From 2003 to 2016, he was the executive director of the Worcester Housing Authority. Currently, he is an opinion columnist for the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, and a political consultant for local, state, and national candidates. He holds a master's degree in public administration from Clark University. So 2 absolutely wonderful panelists. We will first start with Elizabeth Sweet.
Thank you so much. And I just want to start by thanking the Rappaport Center at Boston College Law School and the Rappaport Institute at Harvard Kennedy School for hosting this conversation today. It's really a pleasure to, I guess, share the screen with such an esteemed panelist and moderator. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to this conversation. There are more than 1 million immigrants in Massachusetts, representing about 17% of our population. In some cities and towns, US Census data actually shows a much higher percentage. For example, in Chelsea, immigrants make up about 45% of the population. In Lawrence, 38%. Here in Boston, it's about 28%, around more than 100,000 people. Our immigrant population is diverse, including many individuals in various forms of legal status, ranging from permanent residents or green card holders to those DACA recipients who came to this country as children, went through our educational system, and now have legal status, and then individuals with various temporary statuses. Of the approximately 100,000 immigrants in Boston, for example, an estimated 48,000 have legal permanent resident status. Many of the immigrants in our communities have lived in the United States and in Massachusetts for many years. In fact, more than 600,000 immigrants in Massachusetts have lived in the United States for 10 or more years. These folks have paid taxes, purchased homes, sent their children to school, raised their children in our communities. Immigrant-led households in Massachusetts paid in 2018, which is one of the most recent years with clear data around this, $4.5 billion in state and local taxes. Those taxes are paying for our public schools, roads, libraries. And immigrants fill so many of those hard but essential jobs that drive our economy. And particularly so many of those jobs that throughout these past years of the pandemic, we've lifted up as being some of those frontline heroes that we recognize and appreciate. And yet, these members of our communities do not currently have the right to cast their vote for school committee, for counselor, or select board in their town. And so our elected leaders do not represent the full diverse communities of their towns and cities and consider all of these taxpayers in making their decisions. They are, in fact, an example in our communities of taxation without representation. We think of voting as a right that comes with citizenship in this country, but that was a policy decision and was not true throughout the history of our democracy. At our country's founding, and even through the 1920s, 40 different states have allowed non-citizens to vote at various points in local, state, and even sometimes in history in federal elections. Limiting voting to citizens was a political choice during periods of anti-immigrant sentiment. However, there are increasing localities across the country that are reconsidering this. Some cities have actually allowed non-citizen voting in local elections for many years including what happens to be my former city of Tacoma Park, Maryland. They actually have allowed all residents the right to vote in local elections since 1993, and carefully set up mechanisms to separate local elections from federal, since of course those same non-citizens cannot vote in the federal elections. New York City has passed non-citizen voting last year, and there are towns in Vermont and Maryland and other localities that have also decided to allow non-citizens the right to vote in their local elections. In some places, such as San Francisco, non-citizen parents are permitted to vote in school board elections. When we disenfranchise these community members, we really send the message that even permanent residents are less welcome to civic participation, even on these basic local issues that equally affect them and their families. At the same time, we struggle to achieve goals of greater voter participation and civic engagement. Giving citizens, non-citizens, the ability to vote in local elections and begin a process of more meaningful civic engagement in the US may yield greater participation as they become citizen and move toward full voting rights. On the local level, we share so many of the same goals for our communities. We want to see our roads repaired, our schools strengthened, our public services well run. Voting in local elections by all those lawfully present would really encourage us to build communities that build on our common interests and represent all of us. I'll pause there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Ray.
You know, my mother was an immigrant. If you can believe it, she was one of 21 children. She grew up in a family that was dirt poor. So poor, in fact, that she was sent away to work for a family in the city because her family couldn't afford to feed her. She cooked their food, she cleaned their house, she cared for their children. After the war, she met my father and came to live in America, where she had no family and no friends. Along the way, my mother had 9 children, and she was the center of our family. She was involved in everything that we did. As a young boy, I remember I was an altar server, and a new priest in our parish stopped me and said, "Mariano, is your mother French?" Now, with a name like Mariano, that's not a question that you get asked very often. I said, "Well, yes, Father, it is. Why would you ask?" He said, "Well, you're the only altar boy I've ever met who pronounces his Latin with a French accent." That was my mother. You know, it never bothered us that my mother wasn't able to vote. It didn't, because elections never meant much in my neighborhood. We grew up in a large public housing project where almost no one ever voted. But as I grew older, I became interested in government and in politics, and I discovered the power of democracy and citizens asking for change and the power to vote. I remember when my mother told me that she was going to try and become a citizen. And I remember how nervous she was when she was studying for a citizenship test. I remember how proud she was when she became a citizen and how proud all of her children were of her. And I especially remember how proud she was the very first time she voted, because the first time she voted for her young son, whose name was on the ballot. You know, throughout my public career, whenever I faced a tough issue, I always tried to imagine what I would want if someone that I loved, someone in my family, for example, was impacted by that decision. I remember more than 20 years ago, someone came into the mayor's office and asked me to publicly support gay marriage. Now, at that time, almost no elected officials were publicly supporting gay marriage. I tried to imagine how I would feel if one of my children, one of my boys were gay and my daughter was lesbian. What would I want for them? And thinking about them, well, of course, I'd want them to have the most full life that they possibly could. Have a partner if that is what they chose, to have a family if that's what they chose. Thinking about my family made the decision very easy. Of course, I supported gay marriage. My mother raised 9 children. She attended meetings with all of our teachers. She went to work. But until she became a citizen, she was never allowed to vote. And if she asked me if I thought that non-citizens, immigrants like her, should be allowed to vote, I would tell my beloved mother that I would help her become a citizen so that she can enjoy all of the advantages of being an American citizen. You know, in many of the graduate and undergraduate classes that I've taught, I ask my students a question. What is the highest rank in our government? Who holds the highest position? Now, most students would say that it's the president. Every once in a while, someone will say it's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But the highest rank in our system of government is the rank of citizen. It's the citizen who is the foundation of our democracy. It's the citizen who has the ultimate authority to decide who our leaders will be. Being an American citizen carries with it certain responsibilities, and it also carries with it certain privileges. And the highest among these, the most fundamental, the most important, is the right to vote. The issue of allowing non-citizens the right to vote in local elections, or any election for that matter, is not a partisan issue. Today, in today's toxic environment, people think of issues as red or blue or Democrat or Republican. This isn't one of those issues. And it's not an issue of the value and the contributions of immigrants, men and women who built this country and who today continue to make significant contributions to our state, to our cities, and to our country. Most of those immigrants came seeking a better life. Many of them fell in love with their beloved country, and most couldn't wait to become citizens. And it's certainly not an issue of who pays taxes. There are people who don't pay taxes who have the right to vote. And there are people who pay a considerable amount in taxes who can't vote in certain local elections. The issue of who gets to vote in any election revolves around the value of citizenship. We should encourage immigrants who want to be full participants in our country to become citizens. And we should cheer for them when they take that step to become citizens. And it should warm our hearts when, for the very first time, they walk into a voting booth armed with the responsibility of someone who holds the highest rank in our government, the rank of citizen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. So let me start with a question for each of you, and since Elizabeth went first this time, and I'll start with you. So can you tell us why local voting should be linked to citizenship? So you've eloquently argued that it is linked to citizenship, but you haven't explained to us why that is the case, that it should be. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on why it should be the case, as opposed to just the assertion that it should be the case.
Well, the primary argument that I've heard for allowing citizens to vote in local elections, I really don't see
what should be unlinked. That is my argument is, why do you believe citizenship and voting in local elections ought to be linked together? And so I wanted to hear some thoughts from you on that. I just wanted to make sure my question was clear.
I see no difference between local elections, state elections, and federal elections. The fact of the matter is, you can make the same argument about contributions of immigrants to the local community that you can to the state and to the federal government. In fact, one of the arguments for citizens voting in local elections is that they pay taxes. Well, they pay state taxes too, and they pay federal taxes, and they make contributions at all those levels. So it doesn't make sense to me that they should be treated differently. My argument relative to citizenship applies at all levels.
Okay, just to push point one, because I didn't quite get an answer to the question. So let's assume for now that the argument applies to all levels. All right, but why should it be, why should citizenship be the line for political participation? Now, I think there's something to be said about the local level, because it is the place that most directly affects the individual, right, where they live, the municipal services, et cetera, right? So I think there's something to be said for distinguishing between local and national. But just for the moment, can you tell me why you want to link those two things together?
Well, I could repeat my opening statement, but because that carries with it the fundamental reasons for my argument. Look, there are dozens of ways that non-citizens can participate actively, successfully, and have their voice heard at the local level. And they can attend city council meetings. When I was chairman of the city council, we never asked them Are you a citizen or are you not a citizen? They can call a city councilor or a school committee member and offer their opinion. I remember a fella, we get to be good friends. His name was Eddie from Ghana. Had no idea, and to this day don't know if he was a citizen or not. He called and asked for help, and I argued and fought as hard as I could for him as I would for a member of my own family. You can speak up on social media. You can support candidates for office. In Worcester, I don't know that this applies to every community, but in Worcester, you can serve on dozens of boards and commissions. You can serve on the planning board, the zoning board. If you're interested in parks, you can be on the Parks Commission.
So
you can serve on the health board. No, let me finish. You can serve on the health board, and you can make decisions relative to the pandemic. If you want to be on, if you're interested in schools, you can participate in the PTO. None of those things requires you to be a citizen. So the argument that someone doesn't have their voice heard or can't participate in, politically speaking, in local government is not true.
So what makes voting different? So if you can do all of those things, you can contribute money, you could do everything. What makes voting different? Why do you draw the line at voting?
Because I believe it is the fundamental right of a citizen. It's the highest duty and privilege of a citizen. Without that, then anyone should be able to vote. We have people who don't pay taxes who vote. We have people who pay taxes who aren't allowed to vote in certain local elections. So for me, the value of citizenship and the privilege of voting must be attached.
Okay. Elizabeth, so Ray argues that, look, if you want to vote, just become a citizen. And we're talking about legal residents, right? So, and I think subsumed within his argument too was this is also an incentive for people to formally join the community. Like if you're saying that I want a fundamental say in this community, then you should formally join the community. You don't get to speak to somebody else's church or synagogue or, school or whatever by saying, hey, I'm an outsider, but I want you to do what I say. You formally join the community that you want to be a part of if you want to have a say. Okay, what's wrong with that? Why not simply, you want to vote, you become a citizen?
The argument about the opportunity to become a citizen is a complex one. The reality is that conveniently forgets that this process takes years, and for some folks, even decades. Our law currently requires that a green card holder or a legal permanent resident be present in the United States for 5 full years before they can apply for citizenship. And these days, we are unfortunately navigating a greatly backlogged immigration system. And so even at that point of eligibility, at that 5-year mark, if someone goes down to immediately file their paperwork to become a citizen, and pursue those full voting rights, there's a lot of delays right now. I actually just this past weekend happened to volunteer with a naturalization clinic where we actually help folks fill out their paperwork to become citizens. And I had to advise some of these fully eligible folks that they would be waiting 12 to 16 months for that application to be processed. In the meantime, we've recognized in court cases, for example, that college students who often anticipate just living for a few years in a city have the right to register to vote and participate in local elections. We don't have meaningful voting residency requirements other than for non-citizens. But to come back to the other piece of your question, which I think is also an important one, is the issues are vastly different on the local level from what is at issue in, say, a federal election. I think there are very different arguments and considerations for federal elections where things like our foreign policy are at issue. Here on the local level, those aren't the kinds of issues that we're tackling. We're thinking about what's best, again, for our kids in schools. We're thinking about what's best for our public services. And folks who are here, especially as legal permanent residents, have a really great stake in that. And I think that argues strongly for considering giving lawful permanent residents the right to vote.
Just to push the point further, though, I didn't understand Ray to say that that people who are here, permanent residents who are non-citizens, they don't have a stake. I think he fully conceded that they have a stake and that they can participate. But the point was, look, just take the steps and join. As I understood your argument is that, well, yeah, it takes time, but sure, lots of things take time, and eventually, you will be admitted as a formal member of the community. So it seems like the one thing that you're hanging your hat on is the fact that look, this could take a year or two, whereas say college students can flit in and out without any sense of permanence to the communities. That is really time sort of the core of the debate that we're having here?
No, I think time is just one element. I think it also is about the issue of what our representation looks like and whether our leaders are really considering the rights of all community members, the needs of all community members, especially with some of the diversity that we have in our communities.
So Ray, can I ask you about that? Is it possible for elected officials to take into account the needs of the whole community when some of them can't officially participate and are not likely to? Only the exceptions would, but are not likely to, given the fact that they are not permitted to vote for their local elected officials.
Sure. If I can, let me just respond to something that Elizabeth said at the end. She talked about the difference between local elections and federal elections. Let me say this to you. I've worked campaigns all over the country at all levels. State elections and city elections are very much the same. We don't discuss, Governor Baker doesn't discuss foreign policy. He talks about schools, he talks about roads, he talks about parks, he talks about infrastructure, things that you talk about at the local level. And I've done presidential campaigns around the country, and almost never does the issue of foreign policy come up. I know it's an issue, but it almost never comes up. They talk about all of the benefits that we all talk about. I think the argument for non-citizen voting can and should be applied across the board. As to your question, let me go back to what I said earlier. Throughout 25 years in public office, almost every time someone came to me, well, many of the times people came to me, if they could have been immigrants or not immigrants, I never knew. Some families, of course, I knew for generations, but the fact of the matter is people came all the time to the city council meetings, they came to the mayor's office, and my colleagues and I treated them all the same. When someone had a problem, we tried to solve it. In our schools, we try to be representative of all the students. We don't ask if they're citizens or their parents are citizens. It's foolish to think that, and I don't know what it might be like, in Louisiana or Alabama or someplace else, but around here, everybody who comes through the door gets treated pretty much the same.
Let's go to a couple of questions from the audience, and please keep your questions coming. One question attendee asked, I'm curious about the cost of becoming naturalized. When Mr. Mariano's mother became a citizen, I'm also curious about the implications that allowing non-citizens to vote somehow devalues citizens voting. Why is that the case?
I'm not sure I understand the question, the last part of that question.
I think the last part of that question is the assumption that allowing non-citizens to vote devalues the citizens and devalues the benefit of being a citizen. I think that's what the question is getting at.
There are very few privileges attached to being a citizen. You can run for certain public offices and receive certain kinds of employment that non-citizens cannot. But the most fundamental value of citizenship is the right to vote. The most important, a citizen holds the highest rank in our government. And that's not just my opinion, that's the opinion of our founders. And the fact of the matter is, we should cherish that right, and it should apply simply to citizens. I have no idea, by the way, what the cost is to go through the process to become a citizen. I don't know. I know that when my mother did it, it couldn't have been very much because, we were used to living on hand-me-downs. So I'm imagining that it's not very expensive today, but I'm sure there is a cost attached to it.
Elizabeth?
Sure. I mean, just to quickly address that question on the financial cost, it does cost, I believe, around $900 for someone to actually file the paperwork to go from having a green card to having citizenship. However, for many folks, this is often the end of a very long, very expensive process, of many steps to arrive to this place. Our immigration laws are convoluted, and again, a lot of the processing is quite backlogged. And so there are so many individuals in our communities who have that intention to ultimately become citizens, and yet are navigating their way through it. And in the meantime, are experiencing that taxation without representation.
Can I make a comment?
Sure, please.
Okay, look, because the process is cumbersome, and Elizabeth would know much better than I would, because the process is cumbersome, takes some time, it might even cost some money, we shouldn't use that as an excuse to allow people to take away, let me say that again, to allow non-citizens the privilege of voting. I support streamlining the process, shortening it, making it easier. If there are costs involved, waiving those costs. We ought to do everything we can to allow people to become citizens when they want to become citizens. If they're excited about being a part of this country, we should be excited about having them. But that shouldn't be the excuse to allow people to vote.
I'd like to call my friend Dan, who's an expert too in this area. Dan, if you wouldn't mind jumping in for a few minutes.
Yeah, thanks. This has been fascinating, and I have a couple of questions for Ray and one question for Elizabeth. I would preface it by saying that this debate has really come down along sort of classic lines that we might say Ray is articulating what some people would call the strong theory of citizenship, that it has to have some core and that things should be political participation. And Elizabeth is articulating what some people call the sort of weaker theory, not to say one is stronger than the other, but just that citizenship ought to count for less and we should look at how people actually live. And Ray, I would just pose to you a couple of questions about the strong theory of citizenship that have come up in the immigration law field recently. And I wonder how you reconcile them, because I think there's sort of, there are problems with that theory. One is the fact that non-citizens are subject to selective service and actually can be drafted. What do you make of that? How do you reconcile that? Are you against that or are you for that? Because some would say that that's an equally, difficult question of should that only be limited to citizens? Let me pose there's three questions, so I'll give you, and then give you all the time in the world to answer them, because I love the way you frame these questions, and I'd be curious to see how you answer them. A second problem that has emerged recently with the strong theory of citizenship is that around the world, increasing numbers of people for a variety of reasons have multiple citizenships. This is a really common and growing phenomenon. And some commentators have argued that strongly argues against the strong theory of citizenship. In other words, that citizenship should actually count for quite a lot less than it did even 30 years ago, and certainly in your mother's generation, when, by the way, it was a lot easier to immigrate and to become a citizen, but that you already answered that. The third question I wanted to ask is, what do you make of the debate about the birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants? Because typically people who hold the strong theory of citizenship oppose that. I mean, so you're using the metaphor of a naturalized citizen, that is your mother who really wanted to come here and benefited from it. That's sort of a classic narrative. But others say, well, if citizenship counts for that much, maybe we shouldn't give it to the children of undocumented who just happen to be born here. But of course, with that, then you run into a problem of the 14th Amendment. So those are three questions for you. Let me pose the question for Elizabeth, and then I just would love to hear both of you address all these things. For Elizabeth, my question for you is, why limit it to people with legal status at all? I mean, if you're going to be functionalist about it, why not be functionalist all the way down? We have undocumented people, DACA recipients, you know, as well as anybody, who are as much a part of the community as the people who happen to have managed to get green card status. You know, so it seems like you're conceding something to the law, but I'm not sure why you drew the line where you did. So I'm going to stop talking now and thank Guy for giving me the opportunity to weigh in here. And I'd love to hear your answers to these problems, which I, by the way, spend a semester trying to sort out and don't come to definite answers about. Anyway, I should disclose.
Sure. Well, since you asked me first, by the way, I love your use of the word strong. Keep it up. I think it's great. Let me answer the last one first. I think it's foolish. I think the argument about birthright citizenship is foolish. Of course, they're citizens. They were born here. They should be citizens. There isn't much to discuss in my mind beyond that. I also think that relative to selective service, somebody serves in the armed forces, that is more than their citizenship test. They should automatically, if they serve and defend this country, they should be citizens the very first day that they put on the uniform. That's how I feel about it. Relative to multiple citizenships, well, I'm not an expert as you are, Professor, so I really don't know the answer to that. And so I'm going to defer on that one.
Shall I respond? So I think you're raising a really interesting question, and it does raise so much of the complexity of this question of where do you draw the line and why do you draw that line? And I chose to argue today for the ability of those here who have lawful status here to vote, because I think that is a reasonable and meaningful line to draw, where individuals have pursued and secured some type of legal status, particularly lawful permanent residence or a green card. Those are individuals that are showing a true intent to be part of our community for the longer term. And so I think there's a particularly strong argument then for them to have the ability to vote. I did want to just pick up on something, because I think the raising of the reality of children who are born here and therefore have citizenship, often to parents who maybe do not have status, actually is an interesting issue in this also. And just wanted to add the argument that I did not raise earlier, that in fact, those folks are also an interesting category. I think often we assume that children don't have the ability to vote until they're 18 because their parents are representing some of their interests. And when you think about the fact that we have many citizen children whose immigrant parents do not currently have the ability to vote, those folks have less of a voice, than also less representation for them, including in those local issues such as school board that affect them so deeply.
If I can build on Dan's question, I'll start with you, Ray, and then go to Elizabeth. So part of Dan's question, I think, involved the proposition that, look, there are many things that legal residents do that show deep allegiance to the country, right? So whether that's serving in the armed services, but as we've talked about before, I would include in it things like paying your taxes, right? When you're financing the infrastructure, the services of the place in which you live, that both communicates allegiance and as well as belonging. So you've conceded on defending the country. Why not also on financing the country, which is in many respects at least as fundamentally important, and one is contributing one's labor to, right? So one can contribute one's life in a very direct way, but one can contribute one's labor to the flourishing and financing of the services of one's community. Why shouldn't that count? And then Elizabeth, I'll have a different question for you.
Respectfully, I couldn't disagree more. Of all of the
You don't have to
arguments,
do so respectfully.
that's all right. Of all the arguments on behalf of non-citizen voting, the weakest, the most meaningless is that they might be paying taxes. Look, you pay local taxes for the services that you receive. Police, fire, public roads, even the ones with potholes, public parks, public schools. There is no price attached to citizenship, and there should never be a price attached to your ability to vote. The fact that you pay taxes is irrelevant to whether or not you should have the right to vote. And what about the immigrants who don't pay taxes? People like my mother who raised 9 children. Are they any less committed to the community, any less involved in the schools, police, or fire? If you pay taxes, and if paying taxes gives you the right to vote, what about the millions of Americans who don't pay any taxes? Should we take away their right to vote because they don't pay taxes? Citizenship is not based on the amount of money that you pay, and voting should never be based on the amount of money that you pay.
So how did you?
Let me just finish though. The idea that you reduce voting to a business contract, if you pay taxes for services, then you can vote. To me, that's offensive. In other parts of the world, people stand in front of tanks or risk beheading just for the cherished right to vote. There's no monetary value that should ever be attached to voting.
So how do you distinguish that with the concession that you made earlier that, hey, if you fight for the country, then that automatically, that alone automatically qualifies you. So you're basically saying if you're willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, right? So it seems like a price, it seems like a cost. So can you help me understand those two positions?
Well, first of all, some people pay taxes and they can vote. Some people don't pay taxes and if they're citizens, they can still vote. So there are two sides to that. You serve in the country, you risk your entire life, you risk your family's future. You ought to be made an American citizen on day one. So I think there's a huge difference. We have people in this country right now, millions of American citizens who don't pay a dime in taxes for a whole range of reasons, because they're unable to work, because they're unemployed, because they're mothers who can't find childcare. Should we say to them, well, you don't pay taxes, so we're going to take away your right to vote? I think it's wrong to do that. If someone doesn't choose to serve in the armed services, that's their right, and there's no penalty to that. But there should be an acknowledgement that someone really has a love for this country if they're willing to risk their life for it.
Elizabeth, can you clarify the distinction that you made earlier to Dan's question as to why you draw the line between legal residents and non-legal residents, right? I mean, Dan particularly pointed out the DACA recipient, right? Sort of the kid who came here when he or she was 6 months old, right, and is as vested as anybody, fluently speaks the language, the culture, only knows one place, and yet those categories of people, other than the accident of birth, are indistinguishable from core, what you regard as American citizens, would be denied under the framework that you're articulating.
If I articulated differently, then I apologize and very much misspoke, because my intention is to advocate for the ability to vote in local elections for all those with legal status. Right,
but let's assume, right. Let's assume though that we're under the world in which you came and you didn't have, you're a dreamer and we didn't have an executive order, right? So like, so there's the accent of that. So I'm taking that away from you and using that as the example.
Okay, but perhaps just to say once before I respond to that question, I would absolutely advocate for all of those with lawful status to be able to vote in local elections, which would absolutely include DACA recipients or dreamers. The New York law, for example, that was passed last year, allowed that category of individuals to vote in local elections, as well as legal permanent residents or green card holders. But you are raising a really important and complex issue around the reality for undocumented people in this country, many of whom also, so much of what I've said applies to them also, you know, many years of living here, sometimes having gone to school here, paying taxes, etc. However, I do think that the argument for folks without legal status is less compelling at this time, and would really advocate for those, again, who have lawful status and therefore have shown that intent to be a part of our society and have started to go through that paperwork.
So Elizabeth, if I could just jump in on this, and I'll disclose, it's probably clear. I tend to agree with your position on the voting thing. So let me just put my cards on the table. But I do think Ray is raising a very profound question that those of us who tend to support voting rights have to try to answer. And it's a really hard question to answer. But Ray, if I may just put it into the most simple terms, it seems to me that Ray is saying, look, if citizenship doesn't mean the right to vote, then what does it mean? Then it actually means nothing, because in this country, we have rightfully granted so many rights to participate in the workforce and political process. Workers' comp is available. That was actually debated in Massachusetts some years ago, but in most states it is. Driver's licenses are now going to be available. You know, there's a lot of rights that are given to people. So if we don't say that voting is the last thing, then citizenship actually becomes meaningless, doesn't it? So I guess your answer might be, and I won't put words in your mouth. What would your answer be? And Ray, am I correctly stating your position on that?
100%.
So Elizabeth, what do you think? I mean, do you think that citizenship maybe should then be essentially the same thing as permanent resident status? That maybe we shouldn't actually differentiate the two things? Because if we do that, it seems to me we do run into a whole host of problems with the 14th Amendment and the Civil War and the meaning of citizenship for African-American communities historically, and a variety of other really profound questions about citizenship.
It's true, and it raises some really fundamental questions for us. It is interesting because our concept of citizenship in this country is a slightly different concept from what exists in terms of citizenship in many other countries around the world. I'm not an expert on those other systems, but I have understood enough that we have conceptualized citizenship in a particular way here in the United States, and our laws have evolved in very particular ways. I still believe that there is a significant distinction in this discussion between the ability to vote in local elections as opposed to state and federal. And we have not dug into the more complex issues, in my view, of what it would mean to consider non-citizens voting in state and local and federal elections rather than local. So I think there still is a meaningful distinction there, and a different voting right there also.
Ray, can I ask?
Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, you can. If I could just ask the flip side of that question, if you don't mind, and you can go ahead and answer. So the flip side of that question is, the easier we make it for people to become citizens, then the less meaningful that line is, right? So, you know, if it, well, just or finish articulating it, is if it's not that big of a deal, one can move from legal status to citizenship. Then really the debate that we're having is really not much of one, right? It is, look, if it's easy for you to become a citizen, then just become a citizen, and what's the big deal, right? And there I think you would, you know, there I think your point is extremely well taken. If on the other hand, it is harder to become a citizen, right? That is, you have to wait a long time between legal status and citizenship. It's costly, the barriers are significant. Then you might be in this country for a very long time wanting to participate, but held in this second class limbo, right? But then on the other hand, the argument in Elizabeth's favor, the argument swings, I think, a little bit more in Elizabeth's favor. So how should we think about voting, the relationship with voting, and how easy or hard it should be to become a US citizen?
Okay, let me respond to something that Elizabeth said, and then I'll answer your question. There is almost no difference between a local election and a state election. The issues are identical up and down the line. So if you say that we should allow them in local elections, you at least have to admit that the issues are the same, and the next step would be allow them to vote in state elections. Beyond that, I don't think, with all due respect, that you characterize how difficult it is or how easy it is properly. You gave two options. There's a middle ground here. I don't think it should be easy to become a citizen. I think it should take some effort. I think there should be some time. I think people should really want to be citizens. On the other hand, it should not be cumbersome. It should not be costly. And we should help people become citizens. If they don't have them now, and I don't know, I'm embarrassed that I don't know the answer to this, public schools should be offering classes for people who want to become citizens. We should do everything we can to encourage citizenship. And unfortunately, in this country, these days, the environment and the conversation around immigrants and non-citizens has been toxic. And I think that that's disgraceful. But we should make, it should be hard, and it should not be easy. But we should do everything we can to streamline the process and allow people to become citizens. And we should encourage them, and we should cheer for them when they do that.
All right, let's jump to some of the questions in the Q&A, because we've had a number of them, and I think they'll provoke some good conversation. We have about 7 or 8 more minutes of our time on this subject. And again, I will say, I think we could spend a semester debating this. There's so much that's already been raised. One question was, what about undocumented immigrants who are held in detention centers and who are counted through the census, and the state is then given federal funding for them? Should they be allowed to vote? So that, Ray, goes beyond the taxation without representation idea, and raises, I think, a more profound question of the relationship between physical presence and, you know, the way the state benefits from that presence, and why wouldn't they have a voice in that setting? So what do you think about that?
Well, I don't think undocumented immigrants should be allowed to vote. I don't think that legal immigrants should be allowed to vote in local elections. I certainly don't think that undocumented immigrants should be allowed to vote.
Elizabeth, what do you think about people in detention facilities? Is that a friendly amendment that you would accept to your taxation argument?
Really interesting point. And I was not aware, though it is a very strong point that they're making. I had never thought about the fact that folks in detention centers are actually being counted into those census numbers. It certainly is an interesting issue, just in terms of the fact that the federal government actually can move folks within that immigration system around the country, but that's going down a slightly different path of discussion. I think what's really complicated about this question, to be honest, is that that category encompasses a really broad range of individuals. There are individuals who are without status in detention centers because they've just arrived to the US borders, and there are individuals who've been caught up in interior enforcement of immigration laws after many years of living in this country. And so there are folks within this one category with, I think, very different kinds of claims and connections to US society. So I don't think there's one answer to this question. I think it opens up some more complex issues.
Great. Let me raise another one, which is raised by an anonymous attendee, but ironically enough, Guy-Uriel Charles is now occupying a chair that's named after Charles Ogletree, who many of us knew and admired, and I knew quite well. I once participated at a conference at Harvard Law School in which Professor Ogletree asked me this question, which, Ray, I'm now going to pose to you, which is, what do you think about the relationship between non-citizen voting and felony disenfranchisement of US citizens. How do you calibrate those things? I mean, there's some people who say voting is such an important aspect of citizenship that you should possibly be able to forfeit it under certain circumstances, and that's analogous to them becoming sort of disenfranchised as a non-citizen. What do you think about that issue?
Well, it's certainly way beyond the scope of our conversation, but let me say to you that I don't think anybody forfeits their citizenship because they break the law. If they've completed their debt to society, if they're off probation, I think everyone should be allowed to vote, period.
Okay. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So let me put this one, I think would be a good one for Elizabeth. Luke Schuster asks, if non-citizens can vote, is the argument also that they should be able to run for office? They can't be president. I mean, the Constitution does say that, which I think could be an argument in favor of Ray's position or against Ray's position, depending on what kind of constitutional mode of interpretation you want to adopt. But in any case, Elizabeth, what do you think? They should be able to run for office too?
Absolutely. I would also advocate for that. And I think that Ray earlier in this conversation even pointed out that there are offices that non-citizens can run for.
Okay, there's actually now suddenly a lot of questions and comments that are jumping into the Q&A, and unfortunately I can't seem to, oh, there, it's okay. Let me see if this last one here. Well, I think the last question actually relates to issues that we have already discussed. So let me just jump through these again. They suddenly just piled in here at the very end. Well, actually, I'm going to pose one, Ray, that I think is implicit in a lot of what we've been saying. What do you think about this issue, which came up a lot actually in the aftermath of September 11th? The question of US people who happen to have been born in this country, but then expatriate and grow up in Mexico, or there was a famous case involving somebody who had been raised in Saudi Arabia, the Hamdi case that went to the Supreme Court. If you had a large number of people who were born here, but then were raised and grew up in, let's say, Mexico, would you support their right to vote in US elections, even though they had perhaps only spent a week here as babies?
Well, I'm not a scholar relative to voting rights. I mean, I'm pretty familiar with this particular topic. I couldn't possibly give you an educated answer on that question.
Okay, I would just suggest that it does put some pressure on the question of that Guy was raising before about if citizenship can be granted so easily by the accident of birth, which I think is something that we all agree is a good thing. Maybe that argues in favor of a weaker theory of citizenship and a more expansive conception of everybody's rights. Again, the difference between a naturalization mindset versus a birthright citizenship mindset.
Dan, let me say to you that I don't see it quite that way. Citizenship should mean something. If anyone can vote, what does citizenship mean? What is your right as a citizen? The most fundamental right is that you have the ability to vote. Is it perfect? No. Is the system perfect? No. Can there be some changes along the way? I guess yes. But from my point of view, if anyone can vote, then citizenship means very little.
So just to give you all the last word, what is the implication of each of your positions? So let me just start with the one for you, Ray. This was in the question and answer, which is, look, does that mean then that for citizens that voting is a fundamental right and that we should make voting as easy as possible, same-day registration, automatic voter registration, et cetera? Is that an implication for your position? Elizabeth, what is the implication for your position? Can you really distinguish between national and state, as Ray said? Because look, the issues are really the same. All right, so really, if you had your way, when you really want to have citizens voting in national elections, is this purely an instrumentalist argument?
Let me say this. I've worked in campaigns in more than a dozen states around the country, all kinds of offices. I would do everything possible to make voting as easy as possible, registration as easy as possible. I support mail-in voting, drop boxes at every corner, extended hours, same-day voting registration, you name it, I'm for it, because I know how difficult it is to get some people to the polls and to vote. And I also know to be quite candid, how poor voter participation is across the board. In local elections, turnout is very low. In state elections, turnout is very low. Even for president, it's embarrassingly low. So I support anything that we can do to make voting easy for people, because that's something we should encourage.
All right, Elizabeth, you have the last word.
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly with what Ray has just said. I think we should be lowering those barriers and encouraging every member of our community to be able to access voting and vote and have their voice be heard on the issues that affect them. And I do think that that extends to those with legal status voting in local elections. In terms of state elections, I think there is an interesting argument there. It's not one that I currently have a position on, but I'm certainly going to give that more thought after today's conversation.
Wonderful. I'm turning it over to Dan. Thank you to the both of you for participating. You delivered as advertised. It's been a real pleasure. Dan.
Thanks to all three of you. This was really fantastic. My mind is racing. I could keep talking about this forever. I hope to have you in person back at Boston College sometime. We owe you some food, maybe a beer, a mug, something like that we normally give to participants. But thank you all for your generous participation, all three of you. It's really fantastic. Much appreciated.
Take care.